I'm Tish Taylor, and I am the Assistant Director of the Family Peace Initiative program.
And I'm Steve Halley. I'm the Director of the Family Peace Initiative. It's good to be here today.
And I'm Audra Fullerton. I'm the Director of Training at the Family Peace Initiative in Topeka, Kansas. And we have been working, our agency has been working for 25 years to address cruelty in relationships. And with all of the issues and unrest in our world right now, whether we're talking about a global pandemic, systemic racism, or violence in relationships, we feel like a lot of it is impacted by the ideas of abuse and cruelty. And so we wanted to share with you the ways that we think about those things. And so that's what we're here for today. And we're so glad you joined us. Thanks for being here.
And so what we want to do is we want to share with you a little bit about how we think of those things in terms of some definitions. We're going to talk a little bit about definitions today. And so let me see if I can't share my screen with you. And so just starting a little bit with thinking about abuse. When we think about relationships, when we think about some of those things you heard Audra say that are happening in the world right now, you know, abuse can come up in all different kinds of ways. And so, Audra, when you think about abuse, what are some things that come to mind about ways we can be abusive?
I think about physical abuse.
Yeah.
Or emotional abuse as well. Steve, what about you? What do you think about?
Boy, verbal abuse comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm. Financial abuse comes to mind.
Yeah.
I even think about expanding that a little bit when I think about, Steve, you mentioned sexual abuse, but I also think about bullying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that also can include things like neglect.
Yeah. The word control comes up a lot on the list as well. Controlling.
And commonly when we make these definitions with people that we're working with, this is basically the list that comes up. You know, are there others that should be added to this, Tish? Or
No, I think that this is a great list. And so when we think about, you know, these are the different ways that we can be abusive in relationships, and this is oftentimes the context of what we're looking at, I think the question then becomes, then how do we define abuse? What is it that these things have in common? And when we think about it here at Family Peace Initiative, we define abuse as just any attempt to impose one's will over another.
so applying this definition, really what it suggests is that any time that I am trying to make somebody do what I want them to do, or any time that I'm trying to keep them from doing what they want to do, or if I'm trying to make them feel something that I know good and well they don't want to feel, suddenly I've crossed this line into the world of abuse.
That's right. Now, abuse, when we start kind of parsing this out a little bit, you know, it kind of comes up in some different contexts. And so we can start looking at, there's some subcategories of abuse. And so we look at in terms of violence and physical violence. But just in terms of violence, if we're going to consider what are some ways in which we could maybe be violent to somebody, but it not necessarily be physical within its nature.
Mm-hmm.
What are some, yeah.
I think about threats.
Yeah.
And intimidation.
Mm-hmm. Isolation.
Slamming of doors or punching walls.
Mm-hmm. Driving crazy.
Could be calling people names or yelling.
Mm-hmm. Cussing.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some great examples.
I also like to add the one about opening a beer. If someone is violent after they've been drinking, the next time they begin drinking, that partner, victim, whoever it is, has to pay attention to, uh-oh, what's going to happen this time? And right away, they're hypervigilant and on alert.
And so that's exactly how we think about violence. When we start looking at the definition of violence, it's just really, it's any behavior designed to create fear. And there's all kinds of ways in which we can create fear. This is a beautiful list of some things that, we just talked about right now. But it's really anything that shows up within that design.
And I would encourage folks, as you're thinking about these definitions and considering this, make your own list. What are the ways that you've been violent in relationships or in your life? I know for me, it has shown up in relationships in lots of ways. And knowing that list and making that list has been really important for me to understand my own self and understand how I'm showing up in the world and understand the behaviors that I'm using that I need to address if I'm ever going to build a healthy relationship. And so I really encourage folks to build your own list and get to know your own story as well as you can.
But let's keep going. What about physical violence? What are some ways that we can be physically violent in relationships?
Yeah, physical violence is a little bit easier to describe because I understand that hitting and kicking, pulling hair, pushing someone down, I can understand that those things are physically violent as well. Audra, what are some others that would commonly on the list when you make this with people?
On this list, commonly poking and pinching also gets on the list after hitting and kicking, slapping. But I also think,
I'm sorry, Audra.
No, absolutely. That's really important to get on the list. Strangling, oftentimes it comes up as people calling it choking, but it's so important to get on the list. It's happening in relationships at much higher rates than I think folks are aware of. But I also think about the use of weapons, including tasers. And if we're talking about strangling and choking, we're talking about chokeholds. And so all of the ways that we can use physical violence to create fear and to impose our will.
And so when we take a look at all these definitions of abuse, violence, and physical violence, they all land under the category of cruelty, which was a relatively recent realization for me. And in the Family Peace Initiative, we talk about cruelty a great deal, and there's two definitions that we use for cruelty.
So the first one is the intentional infliction of pain and or suffering. And the second way that we define that is just the blatant disregard of another. And so the first one, that's not particularly complicated to understand. That's just, here, I've done something on purpose to hurt you, and it's really clear about that. And so if I hit you, that's a lot of the things that show up in the physical violence category, right? That was done on purpose, oftentimes. And when I start looking at the second definition, though, I think that's the one that's that takes me back a little bit more when I start looking at the blatant disregard of another, because inside of that's just me putting myself first. That's just, I decide not to worry about your needs, your wants, your cares, or how what I'm doing is affecting you. It's just a blatant disregard of you, which then gives me permission to do a whole host of things, not worrying about how it's going to impact those around me at all.
Right. When we start looking at these definitions of cruelty and we look at the list we've just made of abuse and violence and physical violence, it becomes clear to me that all of those behaviors were either the intentional infliction of pain and suffering, or they involved the blatant disregard of somebody else. And suddenly, cruelty was expanded in my mind from a horrible mistreatment of an animal, which is how I've commonly thought of cruelty originally, or the extreme behaviors that sometimes make the headlines about the horrible things that somebody did to somebody else or their partner, to suddenly we're talking about cruelty of just a blatant disregard. So suddenly when I make decisions in my relationship where I don't consider the impact on my partner, about the decision I'm going to make, such as going to make a tea time at the golf course and assigning the child care duties to my partner without discussing that with her, suddenly that became a blatant disregard or an act of cruelty. And it changed my relationship for the better when I recognized how that was working in my world.
One of the things that I look at is I experienced a lot of things growing up, a lot of things that I would have never even recognized as being cruelty. And so I think about just the neighborhood that I grew up in, and I experienced there the ideas of being isolated, singled out, and it was all based on racism. So people were like, oh, I can't interact with her. I grew up in a small town that was predominantly Caucasian. And so it was like, don't hang out with the dark colored kid, right? Because if you did, there was going to be consequences to pay. But I also think about things I experienced in my home. There was domestic violence happening in my home. And so I was surrounded by it, and I just became used to it. It became normal. It became what I expected. And so I was really blind to how I started using it later on in life.
That's one of the dangers in what we call the river of cruelty, is that cruelty becomes normal. It's what we know. We justify that someone deserves to be treated badly. We can do all kinds of things to just explain and justify to ourselves that this is what we're supposed to do. This is the way we're supposed to treat other people, is by intentionally inflicting pain and suffering or by blatantly disregarding them. Moving out of the river of cruelty, the definition of trust that John Gottman uses, the knowledge that one's interest will be considered, seems to be the antithesis to cruelty. How do we consider everyone's interest who lives in our community, everyone's interest who lives in our household, everyone's interest who is impacted by a decision that I might make? The knowledge that my interest will be considered is a valuable place of security for me in my life.
We ask folks, ourselves included, to take responsibility for all the ways that we have passed that cruelty onto other folks, all the ways that we have fallen short and been cruel to ourselves and cruel to other people. Because if we can fully understand the ways that we're showing up in the world, then we can have the power to make a different choice and to show up in the way that we want to show up in the world. But we also ask folks to take full responsibility for healing from the cruelties that we experienced long before we ever passed that cruelty on to other folks. The cruelties that came into our lives for lots of different reasons, but that impacted us. And it's our responsibility to heal from that impact.
So as we watch cruelty on TV happening in front of our eyes, as we're living with cruelty in our families, the cruel acts that we do, or the cruel acts that our loved ones do, or the cruel acts that members of our community do, is evidence of unresolved cruelty that people have experienced long before they ever became cruel to anyone. And so part of this conversation about ending cruelty in relationships or our communities means we have to become brave enough to put the microscope on ourselves and figure out how we can heal from the cruelty that happened to us long before we were cruel to anyone. Now, it's important to say, just because I was treated cruelly as a kid, it doesn't give me an excuse or justification to be cruel to somebody else. It's just evidence. My cruel behavior is a symptom of unresolved cruelty in my life. And so it's just a doorway into the responsibility I have to heal myself. Even though I'm not responsible for what happened to me, I'm responsible to heal from it because other people have the right to be safe.
That's how we have been thinking about these terms in the conversations that we've been having about how do we build a world free from cruelty. Specifically, how do we build relationships free from cruelty? Thank you so much for joining us. We hope we've given you something to consider, something new to think about, and we would love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear how you think about this. So feel free to add a comment below or jump onto our Facebook page and let us know what you think about these definitions. If you feel like they make sense to you, or if you feel like they don't quite capture things. This is a really important conversation for our whole world to be having right now. If we're going to build a world in which everyone is regarded, we've got some work to do.